In the mid-8th century, long before Viking raiders were feared across Europe, a brutal event unfolded on the shores of present-day Estonia. Two ships were buried inland, not in water, each packed with warriors who had died violently. For centuries, they lay untouched, but modern DNA science has now exposed what ancient chronicles never recorded. 4 of the fallen were brothers, not just comrades in arms, kin by blood. Their genetic trail leads back to Sweden's Mälaren Valley, connecting them to a single community, a single family. And when researchers compared their DNA to over 400 other Viking Age remains across Europe and Greenland, a far bigger story began to unfold. A story that challenges what we thought we knew about Viking identity, ancestry, and how far their reach truly extended. Before we dive into this buried mystery, what's your theory? Why were these ships dragged inland and filled with the dead? Tell us in the comments. When archaeologists arrived at the site in Salme, Estonia in 2008, they were expecting construction debris, not a burial from the dawn of the Viking Age. What they uncovered was astonishing. The remains of a ship, clinker-built in the traditional Scandinavian style, dragged onto land and covered with stones. Inside it were the skeletons of 7 tall, young men. Each one was buried with weapons, swords, spears, knives, and surrounded by fragments of deer antler combs, a small axe, and dozens of gaming pieces carved from cattle and whalebone. This was no hasty burial. It was ceremonial, intentional, and unmistakably elite. These findings dated to around 750 CE, decades before the first recorded Viking raid on Lindisfarne. That alone made this grave unique. But the story didn't end there. Just 2 years later, in 2010, a second ship was found only 30 to 50 meters away. Larger, longer, about 17.5 meters, and far more grim. 34 skeletons lay tangled in its hull, many with sharp-cut marks on their ribs, skulls, and limbs. This wasn't a peaceful death. This was slaughter. Archaeologists suspect the dead were attacked in battle, killed suddenly, and buried swiftly by their surviving companions. But what makes this story truly exceptional isn't just the violence or the ships, it's what came next. Forensic archaeologists began analyzing the bones in detail. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the time frame. Isotope analysis of the teeth pointed towards central Sweden, specifically the Mälaren Valley, a region known even then as a seat of power and trade. And then came the breakthrough. Geneticist Marie Allen and her colleague Magdalena Boos extracted ancient DNA from several of the remains. This process, known as a DNA analysis, involves sampling petrous bones, dense parts of the skull that preserve genetic material longer than other bones. Their analysis confirmed what isotope testing had hinted. These were not Estonians. They were Scandinavian. And 4 of the men were biological brothers, sons of the same mother and father. This discovery was first published in peer-reviewed journals including Antiquity, and later cited in broader population genomic studies, such as those led by renowned researcher Eske Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen. Willerslev's team had analyzed over 400 Viking-age skeletons from burial sites across Scandinavia, the British Isles, Greenland, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. And the Salme brothers fit right into this genetic puzzle. DNA comparison placed the brothers within a genetic cluster common in central Sweden. But what was even more telling was that the rest of the ship's crew, those who died alongside them, shared close regional ancestry. This wasn't a crew of strangers thrown together by chance. It was a kinship group, likely a warrior band, raised together and trained together from the same homeland. Why were they in Estonia? That remains a matter of debate. Some scholars argue they were on a diplomatic mission, supported by the absence of female graves and the presence of finely made gaming pieces, which could signal peacetime prestige rather than wartime preparation. Others point to the weapons, armor fragments, and hawk remains, symbols of Norse elite warrior culture, and argue it was a raiding expedition gone wrong. One theory, presented in the Journal of Archaeological Science, suggests a failed alliance. Perhaps they came to support an Estonian faction in a local conflict, only to be ambushed by rivals. The hurried burial of the second ship, with uncleaned wounds and stacked corpses, supports this. It looks like survivors did what they could to honor the dead, dragging the ship inland, covering the bodies with stones, and then disappearing. There's also the fact that the Salme site predates most known Viking raids. This challenges long-held timelines. If these warriors were raiding or negotiating across the Baltic in 750 CE, then the Viking expansion didn't begin with Lindisfarne in 793. It began earlier, and with more sophistication than the history books usually allow. This isn't speculation, it's rooted in data. DNA, isotope analysis, carbon dating, weapon typology, and the layout of the graves all tell the same story. These were not isolated travelers. They were part of a larger social and political network moving across the Baltic before the Viking Age officially began. And their presence in Estonia wasn't random. So the question deepens. If this was a family unit of noble warriors, what were they doing in hostile territory so far from home? And more importantly, why didn't their story survive in the sagas? The answer may lie not in what was written, but in what was buried. For centuries, the Viking Age was told through sagas, poetic, dramatic, and often exaggerated accounts passed down generations. But DNA has no interest in legend. It simply tells the truth. And when researchers broadened their scope beyond the Salme brothers, what they discovered shook the foundations of Viking identity. In a groundbreaking study led by Professor Eske Willerslev and published in Nature in 2020, scientists analyzed over 400 Viking Age genomes across Europe, from Greenland and Iceland to Russia and Poland. One of the most surprising revelations? Vikings weren't genetically homogeneous. In fact, they were surprisingly diverse. 2 individuals from a Viking burial in the Orkney Islands, for instance, had no Scandinavian ancestry at all. They were genetically Scottish. And yet they were buried with swords and grave goods in a clearly Norse cultural style. This tells us something radical. Being a Viking was not strictly about blood. It was about identity, allegiance, and probably function in society. You could be born a Celt and still die a Viking. But how did all this diversity enter the Norse gene pool? That question led scientists at Stockholm University to conduct one of the most comprehensive genetic studies of the region ever attempted. They sequenced DNA from over 17,000 modern Scandinavian individuals, alongside nearly 300 from ancient burials. The samples came from every era, massacres like Sandbyborg, aristocratic boat burials at Vendel, medieval cemeteries, and even the wreck of the Cronin warship that sank in 1676. What they found was a timeline of migration. Between 400 CE and 1000 CE, Scandinavia was a genetic crossroads. People from the British Isles were migrating into Norway and Sweden. Eastern Europeans, likely from modern-day Finland, Russia, and the Baltics, were settling around Lake Mälaren and Gotland. And traders or travelers from southern Europe were influencing the gene pool in Denmark and southern Sweden. But here's the twist. When researchers looked at how long these foreign ancestries lasted, they discovered that many of them didn't persist. By the start of the medieval period, roughly 1100 CE, much of this outside DNA had faded from the gene pool. Why? Likely because many of these migrants didn't have large families. Some may have been slaves. Others may have been temporary visitors, diplomats, raiders, or laborers. and some may have simply been outnumbered by the native population. This idea is backed by the low transmission rates of non-local ancestry. In a statistical model shared by the Stockholm team, gene flow from the east peaked during the Viking era but declined sharply afterward. In contrast, local Scandinavian lineages continued to dominate into the modern era. And then there's the Uralic component, a genetic signal shared by Sami people, Finns, some Central Asian groups, and even Native Americans. This DNA signature was rare during the Viking period, but it grew more prominent in northern Scandinavia in the centuries that followed. 17th century remains from the region show a spike in this ancestry, which persists in modern populations today. This changing genetic landscape paints a more complex picture of Viking society, one that wasn't a static ethnicity, but an evolving mix of cultures, languages, and loyalties. It supports the theory that being a Viking was more of a role or a way of life than a strict ethnic category. But returning to the Salme brothers, what does all this mean? Their DNA reveals a tightly knit band of warriors from the Mälaren Valley, likely trained together, raised together, and perhaps even bound by blood oath. Their burial with ceremonial goods, decapitated hawks, and gaming pieces indicates elite status. And yet their deaths, stacked in a boat hastily buried after a violent skirmish, show how even the highest ranks could fall far from home. There's one more fascinating detail most viewers miss. The boat itself was Scandinavian in design, but constructed using local Estonian timber. That suggests either the ship was built on site for burial, or, more likely, it was captured, repurposed, or refitted during their time in the region. That minor clue could mean these Vikings had been operating in the Baltic for weeks, or even months before their final stand. Some Estonian scholars believe the burial was a form of ritual diplomacy, a way for local tribes to show respect to worthy enemies. Others argue it was the Vikings themselves who buried their dead before fleeing or being killed elsewhere. Either way, the burial is an act of memory, an attempt to preserve honor even in defeat, and that brings us full circle. The DNA of four brothers, preserved for 1,200 years, now gives voice to a chapter of Viking history that would have otherwise vanished. A story of kinship, exploration, conflict, and identity, told not through runestones or poems, but through the language of genomes. Today, we often imagine Vikings as one thing: blonde-haired, blue-eyed warriors from the icy north. But the truth is richer, messier, and far more human. They were sons, brothers, travelers. And sometimes they never returned home.